Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof, the 1st of November 2023. Before we go to the military aid segment where I normally start, I forgot to give you the Ukrainian loss figures as according to the Russians for yesterday. So a game of fantasy figures are being played out again by Russia's defense minister, says Tim White. Sergei Shoigu today claiming in October, I mean it's not for yesterday, it's for October, they shot down 37 aircraft and 6 ATACMS. It's interesting because they've also shot down apparently 8 Storm Shadow in one day. He then calculated with so few F-16s promised to Ukraine, they'd shoot them all down in 20 days. Of course, Sergei Shoigu appears to be living in a dream world, and it could be why I don't give you the Ukrainian loss figures very often, because when you hear them from the Russians, you have a slight air of disbelief. Right, we are going on to military aid, and there's not too much to report, to be honest. We perceive this as nothing more than the growing involvement of Great Britain, Germany and France in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The line between indirect and direct involvement is gradually disappearing. That's Dmitry Peskov talking about the F-16s being provided to Ukraine. It's kind of a weird position. All these countries are giving F-16s to Ukraine, and that's kind of crossing line to direct involvement. What's the difference between an F-16 and, a machine gun? An F-16 and a tank, an F-16 and a Humvee and a piece of ammunition. These are kind of arbitrary distinctions, but I think it gets Peskov to be able to blame the West more and be able to say you've crossed the red line, even though this is just, one unredlinable, I think, bunch of assistance where you can try and make some meaningful distinction between, I don't know, a Humvee and a Bradley and a tank and an AMX-10 and a helicopter and a jet, and then the missiles that are fired from the jets. So I don't know. I don't really go along with this kind of thinking. I think it's just Peskov sounding off here. I wonder whether there will be a stage. I mean, the problem for Russia is if they really say you've crossed the red line and do something, properly bad, and NATO gets involved, Russia will be absolutely destroyed. So Russia have to play this very careful game where they can shout about red lines, but they can't really do anything about it. Because if they do something about it that's too meaningful, it'll bite them on the backside. Right, Ukraine will receive 335 million euros in aid from European Commission today. The government approved an agreement on financing the EU support for recovery and reforms programme, says Prime Minister Shmyhal. That's really good. They obviously need as much money to reconstruct their whole country, I guess, and that's particularly helpful from the EU. In fact, we'll be returning to the EU in the geopolitical segment. I mean, sometimes there's kind of a bit of a false distinction in this segment and help they're getting both militarily and in terms of humanitarian and civil aid and the sorts of thing I talk about in the geopolitical section. Right, this is an example of the evolution of drones. Look at the size of this drone, how small it is. With an RKG-3EM anti-tank grenade, up to 400 grams high explosives, Rush Cherry antenna, 5.8 gigahertz, and a 4-engine FPV first-person view drone, the 10th Mountain Brigade of Ukraine in Donetsk, eastern Ukraine, in October 2023. Well, I was talking in my previous video this morning about the ability to fly drones, first-person view kamikaze drones at night and using lower-end, not thermal optics, but nighttime vision, I think is a bit of a game changer. We're seeing drones being used to do dive bombs, as well as, moving from dropping IEDs, looking down, to first-person view drones. There's all these this playing around with capabilities, moving from 10 kilometer range to 22 kilometer range that we're now starting to see. This is a constantly evolving sector of this war, and it's going to be very interesting to see where drones go. We can also talk about unmanned ground vehicles, UGVs. They're starting to use more and more. The Ukrainians. There's talk about. I've mentioned this a number of times with reference to my favorite action film, Aliens, where you have the mounted gun turrets firing at the aliens as they attack the humans in the base on that planet. Well, those are now reality as you have automated gun turrets that are being devised by the Ukrainians, and we've seen one that can raise up and fire and then raise back down. I think operated remotely, but I assume you can have automated systems or maybe autonomous systems using AI. I don't know. I'm fairly sure that's doable. It's whether it's applicable in the context of the Ukrainian war. We are going to see so much. We have seen so much change already in the capability of the equipment used, and that will continue as the war goes on, as there's this kind of arms race between the two sides to get to new capabilities. Anton Gerashchenko talks here about new recruitment scheme. For those unwilling to join the Russian army. So the Russian army has seen a decline in interest in contract service. Who knew? The Kremlin needs to look for new cannon fodder. They have decided that debtors will become contract servicemen. Therefore, all data on those who owe loans was transferred to the Ministry of Defense. Now the debtors will be driven into the army by threats, either pay or go to war. In the third quarter, Russian banks sold overdue debts to debt collectors for a record 75 billion rubles, $800 million. For example, in the second quarter, this amount was $450 million. Basically, a debtor is a credit user who is about 40 years old, has secondary or higher education, has a family, and needs to provide for it. This requires not only a high income, but also benefits such as credit freezes, preferential mortgages. The MOD tempts Russians with all of this. According to the central bank, the most MFI clients are in Tiva, 15.3%, Altai, 9.6%, occupied Sevastopol, 9.4%. Debtors of other loan types mostly live in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Krasnodar region, Sverdlovsk, and Bashkortostan. So that is a bit of a new move. It's all part, I think, of this crypto mobilization of how they are. They desperately need boots on the ground. So they're going about mobilizing without calling for a mass public mobilization. That will be a bit of a political suicide note. Instead, they're doing things like rounding up immigrants, legal and illegal, and sending them to the front lines. They are here looking to recruit people who are in debt to the MOD, effectively. It's, now we have your debt, you're in debt to the MOD. It turns out that your payment will be a contract of service on the front line for the next years. And finally, Ukraine's Air Force spokesperson has revealed Russia has modified its missile of choice, the KH class. Yuri Ignat says that there are various modifications, in particular with an optical guidance head. It can actually fly like a Lancet and is controlled using a camera. So Lancet drone are the loitering munitions that use cameras to locate their targets and then hit them. But of course, that's traveling at not a very fast speed, the Lancet drone, whereas these KH class cruise missiles are going to be going at quite a pelt. And I don't know how useful an optic camera will be. But nonetheless, there is talk about that. I'm sure experts in the threads below can let me know of the pros and cons. Now, The Hill says, moving on to geopolitical stuff, The Hill writes that Biden would veto the GOP, so the Republican Party's Israel aid package, without funding for Ukraine. There's a bit of a political battle going on in the US. It doesn't really help anyone, to be perfectly honest. Mike Johnson, the speaker for the majority GOP in the House of Representatives, has wanted to separate out the $106 billion aid package for a number of places. So Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and the border as well. And Mike Johnson wanting to separate that out looks to be a way of saying, right, we're really in support of Israel, as many on the right wing it's a kind of bizarre political situation. I was talking about this with my mate last night. at rugby practice for our boys, and we were talking about the mess that is Israel-Palestine, and he's actually fairly pro-Palestine politically and saying, you know, Israel, but he sits sort of centre-left, I guess. We're talking about how on the right you have people who would otherwise be fairly anti-Semitic, like from a natural far-right point of view, but then having some kind of dissonance because they see Palestinians as Muslims, and then saying, well, I'm even more anti-Muslim, and so I'm now pro-Israelite because I'm anti-Muslim more than I am anti-Semitic. And so you get this really weird situation where you are starting to see right-wing governments or politicians or people in general support Israel when perhaps they might not have done previously. I'm not saying exclusively, but perhaps that might not have happened previously. And, you know, it's just a changing dynamic. And here we have Mike Johnson, the GOP, wanting to separate the bills out. So because they see Ukraine, for some reason, they see this as now a divisive issue. It really shouldn't. I mean, it's bloody obvious. It's like Russia have been the mortal enemy of the US. I mean, God, if you're talking about the same people will call anyone on the left communist and libtard commie. And you're like, yeah, okay, well, here's your former USSR that you would be historically against. And now you're like stalling on support for Ukraine, who is fighting this battle on behalf essentially of NATO and the US. There are no boots on the ground for the US, and yet you want to give money to Israel, who have already got plenty of kit, really, to be honest, and they're only attacking a 25 square mile area. Arguably Israel don't need any assistance from the US, really. And Ukraine are desperate for it, and yet you're like, no, we're going to give it to Israel, but we want to separate it out so that basically Ukraine don't get it. It drives me nuts. But the US president is fighting back here, saying that he would likely veto the bill put forward by House Republicans to provide aid to Israel without including funding for Ukraine and other priorities. Now, some people are saying actually this is Biden like showing his teeth here and really fighting back, which is kind of a good thing. He's like showing a bit of backbone. Also possibly highlights now, I'm wondering whether the kind of scare quotes failed counteroffensive in terms of territory of the Ukrainians over the last 4 months, which you could possibly argue is the responsibility of it. Well, it's difficult. The lack of land gained might have been facilitated by the slow roll of assistance to Ukraine. So if ATACMS had been given months ago, blah, 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 things could have been different, or at least somewhat different. Now, I don't know whether people in the Biden administration, people in the Department of Defense in the US, NATO thinkers, yada, 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 people are now going, right, we really need to just give them as much as possible and as soon as possible, because otherwise war fatigue is going to really affect support for Ukraine, and actually all that we have done in aiding Ukraine will be wasted, because actually the long game that Putin's playing might have some kind of merit, so on and so forth. So it could be that people like Putin and Blinken, people like Biden and Blinken might be going, right, okay, we just got to go all in here, and I hope that's a kind of realization that's taken place. Now, this is interesting. So Republican Mike Garcia, I'm going to give him some props here. So I'm not just all anti-Republican. Republican Mike Garcia has published a list of demands for the GOP to support continued US funding for Ukraine. And you might think, well, here's some guy who is just not wanting to support Ukraine, so he's going to put up a bunch of demands. But actually, some of these demands are fairly sensible. So key points, I mean, I haven't really gone to look into this in any detail. I'm just looking at what Tim White says here. So, yeah, pinch of salt. Key points are more transparency and victory strategy that will include precise assessments, the ultimate goal, and criteria for ending the war. And actually, I think that's been lacking from the Biden administration, actually from most supporters of Ukraine around the world. There's been, and I've talked about this before, we'll be in for as long as it takes. Yeah, what does that mean? Like 20 years? No, I'd rather not, thanks. I'd rather this get sorted out as quickly as possible. This needs to, so in order to do that, you need to set out, like, I could bore you with like everything in life. Like morality is goal orientated. So until you set out your goals of how things look, you can't really work out how to get there. It's the same with any kind of strategic planning. I think the US, and I'm using US as an example here, but you can talk about any country and you can talk about NATO. Until the US say, right, this is what we want it to look like, really clearly and explicitly, then it's very difficult to say, well, then we need to give you these things. If you're just going to say very vaguely, we're going to be in this for as long as it takes, right? Then when you're starting to strategically plan what weapons you need to give to Ukraine, you're looking at the objective and going, we need to be in for as long as it takes. Okay, how many ATACMS does that mean? It's so vague and meaningless that you can't strategically plan. Whereas if Garcia here is saying, right, we need a victory strategy which comes from transparency, which means precision, which is, okay, what do we want? We want X, Y, and Z. Okay, so we want X, Y, and Z. In order to do X, Y, and Z, we're going to need A, B, and C over here. And we can start saying, well, we're definitely going to need distance munitions. Okay, in order to do that, really, Ukraine are going to have to hit inside Russia. So we're going to say they can use these to hit inside Russia. Yes, okay, that's fine. Okay, and we can then give precise assessments to, you have success criteria because you've got clear objectives. How we're going to get there, okay, how have we done? We can measure our success and we can adapt if needs be. So this strikes me as eminently sensible. And I would agree with attaching these kind of things to a very clear goal set out by the Biden administration, by NATO, by everyone, by the EU. Yeah, let me know what you think and whether I'm just going off on one. Right. The EU is discussing new restrictions that will hit trade with Russia by about... Sorry, I'm just going back to, because this all comes from the top of my head. I wonder whether, and again, I say the US, but I mean everyone, has not been so explicit, because if you're going to be explicit, you'll have to say very clearly, we want Russia to lose and we want this, and that's almost like the US going to war with Russia. So I wonder if the comeback, if I was to be Biden administration saying, right, I'm going to defend myself against Jonathan M.S. Pierce on YouTube. Why haven't we done that? And there must be reasons why they haven't done it. And I think the explicitness of setting out those goals could well be escalatory, could well be very explicitly saying, we want to beat Russia in war, and this is how we're going to beat you, and these are the terms of the beatingness, the beating, so on and so forth. So that might be why you haven't seen that. Let me know what you think of the thread. The EU is discussing new restrictions that will hit trade with Russia by about $5.3 billion. The new package will strengthen restrictions on Moscow's sources of income and industry and limit the Kremlin's ability to feed its military machine. And actually, so what does that look like? New package includes restrictions on exports of welding machines, chemicals, and other technologies used for military purposes, according to Bloomberg. I did a report that came out from... what was the source? It was Liberty Radio, and they did that video where they were looking at companies, like military industrial complex entities within Russia that were using machines that were being, still imported from allied countries and whatnot to Ukraine. And that there were either loopholes or people breaking sanctions, or this maybe happened right at the beginning of the war. But nonetheless, you're seeing these promo videos that the Russians put out. It's like, oh, that bit of kit came from Japan, that bit of kit came from Canada, that came from the UK, that came from the US, that came from I don't know, Germany or whatever. And you're like, okay, that needs to stop. And I wonder whether this is a response to maybe a direct response to that news piece, or a response to at least the idea that the knowledge is out there now of the companies that are still supporting the Russian war effort. Right, Ukraine and Moldova will be able to formally start accession talks with the EU when the long-awaited report is published a week today. However, Politico says there will be major caveats. Caveats for Ukraine: in that document, EU officials and diplomats tell Playbook Brussels will recommend opening accession negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova, conditional on technical caveats where the countries need to make more progress, from building a solid and independent judiciary to protecting minority rights and implementing anti-corruption measures. All of that looks good. Small print. These won't be minor but big caveats, a French official cautioned, adding with a smirk, it wouldn't be the first time that Brussels disguises major political implications as technical details. No fast track for Kyiv. Similarly, a briefing attached to Baerbock's invitation to her colleagues, so she's a foreign minister for Germany in the Green Party, invitation to her colleagues for Thursday's conference obtained by Playbook, warns, quote, there can be no fast track for any country willing to join, adding that both current and future EU member states have to commit to preparing thoroughly for the challenges with an EU with 30 plus members, the challenges that will bring. Of course, they can't fast track, because if you fast track, then the countries that have been waiting in the wings for accession and have been leapfrogged will make major complaints, and there could be legal ramifications and all sorts. Okay. US charges a trio with smuggling electronics to Russia's military. A US citizen and 2 Canadian nationals of Russian origin have been arrested and charged with conspiracy and smuggling critical technologies to Russia vital for advanced military hardware. Good. Jog on. In fact, a bit more detail about this. So, Brooklyn resident and 2 Russian Canadian nationals. Quote, these defendants are alleged to have been to have illegally exported millions of dollars in electronics to support the Kremlin in its ongoing attacks on Ukraine. Over the course of the year, this criminal organization evaded US sanctions and laws, managing to dispatch over 300 shipments of restricted items valued at approximately $10 million to the Russian battlefield. This unlawful activity would have persisted if not for the law enforcement collaborative efforts that led to today's charges. Excellent. Get the bad guys, he said, very simplistically, but correctly. Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić has dissolved parliament and called for early elections for December the 17th. Wow. Previous parliamentary elections were held in Serbia on April the 3rd, 2022. They were won by Vučić's party. Perhaps he wants to raise his rating and avoid mass protests amid a rapprochement from the Russian dictator. People only call for elections if they're going to gain in some way out of it, or maybe lose the least. I think here he'll be playing the system and ensuring that his party remains in power. Serbia is a hotbed of ultra-nationalism at the moment that is fomented and funded, supported by Russia. And I don't see this, well, you know, you hope that the election doesn't go very well for Vučić, but it's looking unlikely given the melting pot that is Serbia at the moment. And finally, French President Emmanuel Macron has arrived in Kazakhstan to meet Prime Minister of the country, Smylov. Presidents of Kazakhstan and France will hold talks on strengthening trade and economic trade and economy, investment and energy cooperation, economic cooperation. Sorry, there was actually grammatically correct there. I just can't read. We'll hold talks on strengthening trade and economic, investment and energy cooperation. Hey, yeah, reading. Ooh, it's cool. I think this is significant. Why? Because you are seeing, again, examples of the West getting involved in these Eurasian nations and pulling them away from the sphere of influence, or attempted to do that, pulling them away from the sphere of influence of Russia. We have seen Armenia cozy up with the West, Azerbaijan also being pretty much anti-Russian a little bit and sending some aid to Ukraine recently. So that's a bit of a change. Both of those nations moving away arguably from Russia, and then you've got Kazakhstan at different times. Is that, you know, they have said no to, they've called the bailiffs in on Roscosmos, haven't they? I believe in one of the space launching sites there. Kazakhstan seems to be not wholly in that Russian sphere of influence. But the caveat is that there is a potential that many of these nations could move closer to China. China's geographically closer, and also its Belt and Road Initiative, like wanting to have its finger in an awful lot of pies around the world. China will be vying for Kazakhstan's attention, as many other countries in that region as well. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Hopefully that has been of some interest. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.